Have you ever picked up a book that you really wanted to read and found that you can barely understand what on earth it is on about? Well, this video is for you. I quite often get comments from people who desperately want to read thinkers like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Camus, but who often find themselves quite lost when they actually go to read one of their works. And I was absolutely in this position when I first started reading them as well. So today, I wanted to share my process for reading really difficult books and, more importantly, understanding them. Now, obviously, this is just my approach, and it's certainly not the only one. There are aspects of it that will probably just appeal to me, but I hope that it can be helpful for your own reading and make some of these ideas and thinkers just that little bit more approachable. But let's start with what I do when I realize that a book is far too difficult for me to tackle head on. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Laying the groundwork. A lot of things can make a book difficult to read. It can be the complexity of the concepts involved, the obscurity of the writing style, or just the fact that it's not something that you find personally riveting. But all of these are partially alleviated by one crucial thing: knowing the structure of the book. And by this, I mean both the internal structure, that is, what the most important parts of the book are, how the chapters are laid out and stuff like that, and what I call the external structure. That is, how this book fits in with the wider literature around a topic and the other books that the author has written. In both cases, we can really take the sting out of a difficult book by doing a bit of research around it. For example, one of my most recent videos was on Albert Camus' The Rebel, and to put it lightly, this is just not one of Camus' more accessible works. He doesn't quite make it clear in the book why he's writing it, and the internal structure of the work is just quite meandering. I still really enjoyed it, but it made it difficult to tell which bits were most important to Camus. So, after it became clear that the work was going to cause trouble if I tackled it unprepared, I went to a few trusted sources to get some background. The first is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page for Albert Camus. This is a peer-reviewed online philosophy encyclopedia that's kept up to date by some of the best academics in the world. And it's probably the greatest free resource for learning philosophy that there has ever been. When I was studying at Cambridge, almost every professor that I spoke to said it was their first port of call when they were writing a paper on any philosophical subject, and you'll see it cited in almost every philosophy journal in the world. In this case, it helps situate The Rebel against the backdrop of what else Camus was writing at this time, as well as give a brief gloss of its main points. As it happens, I ended up greatly disagreeing with the author of this encyclopedia entry about the book, but it was still very helpful in getting a sense of The Rebel's general structure. It transformed it from what seemed at first like just a wall of text to a work with a definite position in Camus' overall thinking and a set number of points that were most important to make. And this really helped me know which parts of the book were most vital to understand when I was reading it. Other secondary sources that I found really helpful for that video were John Foley's general work on Camus and Oliver Todd's biography of Camus, which I still haven't finished, but I've been dipping in and out of it, and it's been a really good guide to the general contours of Camus' life, and again, has provided additional context for his writings and his philosophy, and there's what the book looks like if you fancy buying it or checking it out. I would recommend it from what I've read so far. I find that a lot of understanding difficult books is knowing which are the main points that the author themselves are trying to make, and then you can interpret the rest of the book around these key ideas. For example, one of the main points Camus wanted to make in The Rebel was to question the defense of Stalin's USSR that was mounted by some French academics around him in the 1950s. This helps explain why he spent so long talking about Hegel and Marx, even though it seems like he could have made his overall point without going into quite so much detail about these particular thinkers. He was expressing his critique in the terms that were most relevant to his targets. Having an interpretation of The Rebel already available also gave me a frame with which I could read the work. In this case, this mainly came out in how I disagreed with a lot of the mainstream interpretations and thought that they caricatured some of Camus' most interesting arguments. I think that John Foley was the only one that I really agreed with. But most of the time, when I read secondary sources, I have a good mixture of agreement and disagreement with them. But the point is, it turned the process of reading The Rebel into a conversation between me and these other interpreters, which just made the process of reading it come alive a bit more. And this idea of reading coming alive is going to be very important in the next section. But before moving on, if you want to make some meaningful sense out of the world around you, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on a judge allowing 14 states to continue in their lawsuit against the Doge Department, while left-wing sources focused on the power that Elon Musk might wield or might have wielded in government. Right-wing sources pointed out that the judge also dismissed claims against Donald Trump himself. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing a small recent rise in Trump's approval rating, or right-wing sources missing the potential effect that tariffs have had on the US tourist industry. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article that I read for bias. So receiving my Ground News roundup at the end of every single day means that I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and just make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've genuinely become my go-to news source, and I really hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. However, I also want to give a quick word of warning. The danger in this stage is that you may begin to simply parrot whatever interpretation you have read when you come to actually read the book, and this can limit the development of your own thinking on the subject. So if you do read some interpretations, it's helpful to see where you might think they go wrong, as well as where you think you'll probably agree. Of course, how you'll go about this will depend on what you're reading. Obviously, my main area is philosophy, but the same general idea applies to lots of difficult literature in lots of different areas. Say you're trying to read some Shakespeare, then laying the groundwork might include familiarizing yourself with early modern English, which is the language he's speaking, or the key themes of this particular play. In Russian literature, this might include just getting to know all the different names that characters can go by. A friend of mine was very confused reading The Brothers Karamazov until he realized that Dmitri and Mitya were the same character. It's difficult to say exactly what you should do in each case because, unsurprisingly, different books are different. But these are the questions that I always tend to go to and research if I'm having a lot of trouble with a primary text. 1. Where does this fit in with the author's general thought? 2. Where does it fit in with the key questions that many thinkers were focusing on in this period? 3. Are there any general things that most interpretations of this work agree on? 4. What are the key points the work is trying to make? And 5. What questions do I have about the received interpretations of the work, and where might I disagree with them? Also, a little note on classic books here. Most editions will have an introduction that you can read before you start engaging with the main text, and I highly recommend that you do so. The possible exception to this is that sometimes it will give away the plot of a fiction book, but otherwise I pretty much always read these little introductions, and I quite often read more than one, particularly by different translators. They're basically written with the express purpose of making the book more understandable for you, and unsurprisingly, are very helpful because of that. I know that it's really tempting to think, I'm here to read Nietzsche, not some guy's opinion on Nietzsche, but I promise that Thus Spake Zarathustra will be a lot more fun to read with this additional context. For example, in my Penguin edition of the work, it outlines some of the key concepts that Nietzsche is going to invoke, like the will to power, the eternal recurrence, and amor fati, and that gives excellent context when you're going to dive into one of the most difficult works in all philosophy. A similar tip works very well for a lot of modern academic books. The introduction of a modern academic book is almost always structured as, here is what I'm going to say, and the conclusion is almost always structured as, and here's how I said it. This means that there'll often be paragraph-long summaries of each chapter at either end, and often at both ends. And this means that you learn exactly what the authors themselves think are the most important points in the book. For instance, at the beginning of Somogi Varga's Authenticity as an Ethical Ideal, he lays out the main contours of each chapter. Roughly speaking, he will examine and evaluate a few different accounts of authenticity, see their strengths and their weaknesses, before formulating his own. He also describes his theory that today we are pressured to perform authenticity, and that this might contribute to some of the exhaustion and burnout that many people feel in the modern day. On the other hand, the conclusion is essentially a very short version of all the book's most important arguments laid out in around 6 pages. This is certainly no replacement for reading the whole book, but it does give us a general structure to sort the ideas into when we actually do read the main body. I know this all sounds a little bit dry, but I promise it will make the process of reading a very dense book much more enjoyable. And personally, I find it makes it far more likely that I will understand the trickier part of it. To clarify, you also don't have to do all of this before you start reading the book. I tend to do a little bit of pre-research and then continue doing this alongside actually reading the work, and especially where I come to more difficult passages. And this leads us nicely onto our next point: the process of reading a difficult book and how to stay engaged with it. 2. The activity of reading. Active reading is kind of a buzzword in the online book sphere. People often use it to just mean ensuring you are actively engaged with a book, rather than sitting back and just letting it wash over you. And I certainly agree that active engagement is important when we're reading, and especially when we're reading difficult books. But there often just isn't a lot of detail out there on how to actually do this, which I think is a real shame, because I think that good active reading can make a very difficult book genuinely a lot more fun. First of all, and I know this sounds quite obvious, but don't bother reading a very difficult book when you are tired or anxious or stressed. Now, there is a distinction to be drawn here. I don't mean the kind of stress that you might inevitably feel if you're preparing for an exam or revising something important. I mean the kind of mind-scatteringly distracting stress that comes when you're feeling so overwhelmed that you can't even think straight anymore. At this point, it is almost always better to do something to calm yourself down first and then get back to reading. Or, if you're just very tired, then really cut down the amount you are planning to read. If you were going to read a chapter, but when you come to it, you're just too exhausted to really focus, then maybe just read a few pages. Honestly, I have tried pushing through when I am too tired or too anxious to think straight, and it's just not worth it. It's fine if you're cramming simple information, but if you actually want to understand something really quite conceptually complex, then you're probably better off taking care of yourself first so that you can be sharp enough to fully take it in. I say that I am terrible at following this advice myself, and quite often end up frustrated from trying to make sense of some mind-boggling new idea in an incredibly dense tome at 3 a.m. So while this point is simple, it's also so simple that we often forget about it in the moment. But with that out of the way, one of the best ways to stay active while reading is to just make sure that you're asking questions of the book as you read. When it comes to nonfiction, most of us are reading in order to learn something. So we probably already had broader questions in our heads when we first picked up the book. If we keep those questions roughly at the front of our minds, then it will be a lot easier to stay engaged, since you are making the book relevant to your mind and so relevant to your attention. The specifics of how to read here will ultimately depend on why exactly you're reading the book. I like a distinction that I once saw a professor draw between reading and raiding. To raid a book is to approach it with 1 or 2 particular questions in mind and remain laser-focused on them throughout the entire reading experience. This is quite a common way to read in academia, where you might be writing a paper or a thesis and be pretty pressed for time, in which case you're really only using the book for a few specific sections related to the topic you're writing on, and thus you only ever really need to keep those 1 or 2 questions in mind and then basically skim over anything unrelated to those. I did my undergrad thesis on how to model word meanings within certain intersections between cognitive linguistics and philosophy, and that involved a lot of books where only a chapter or 2 was at all relevant to what I was writing on, and even most of those chapters were not that helpful. There might be a couple of paragraphs in a 600-page book that would actually be handy to have for my thesis. And so I skimmed the rest and only read in detail when there was something that was actually pertinent to the one or two key questions that I had in mind. This is what I mean when I say we are raiding a book. In this case, we're not really interested in what the book has to say, but rather the few things that we can take from it. But most of us probably aren't reading like this most of the time, so we'll be asking quite different types of questions, the sort that arise in the process of reading the book. Take the following rather difficult section from Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. The old theological problem of faith and knowledge, or to be more precise, of instinct and reason, and so on. The question of whether, with respect to the value of things, the instincts deserve more authority than reason. Reason wants some ground or what for, some purpose or utility behind our values and actions. This is the same old moral problem that first emerged in the person of Socrates and divided opinions long before Christianity came along. Now, what questions immediately jump out at us when we're reading this? Well, the first might be something quite general like, what on earth is he getting at? But we'll set that aside for now. Here are some that sprang to my mind. What is the connection between faith and instinct and knowledge and reason, and why are they paired off like this? What is the relationship that Nietzsche is drawing between instincts and the creation of values, and why does he consider this theological? When Nietzsche says that reason wants some grounding, what does he mean by this? Is this an epistemic grounding, or a moral one, or a practical one? What is the common link between Socrates and Christianity in this section? The point is not necessarily to answer all of these questions, and certainly not to answer them in the moment, but asking them means you're much less likely to just skim over a difficult paragraph, and it naturally turns reading into an incredibly active process. It'll also help you identify which parts of the text are making sense to you at the moment, and which might require a bit of further investigation. It is more than okay not to understand something like this the first time you read it. With sections of Nietzsche, I'd sometimes have to go back over them many, many times before they make any sense to me. But this process helps us recognize where our understanding genuinely is incomplete. Additionally, asking questions throughout the process of reading a book will let you know which parts of the text you are most interested in. For example, if all your questions when reading Nietzsche are about his attitudes towards Christianity, then you've immediately discovered which part of Nietzsche's work most appeals to you. As in the last section, a big part of the purpose of this is prioritization. It is almost impossible to understand a really difficult book without working out which parts are the most important for you. When a lot of people think of reading well, they imagine paying equal attention to every word in a book. But this is often a total disaster when it comes to really hard texts. Reading a really hard book is less like following a linear path and more like solving a crossword. You can't tackle every single clue at once. It is worth picking out the ones that you think you can understand more easily, and then using the information you get from solving those clues to solving some of the ones that you find more difficult. That doesn't mean that you won't finish the crossword, it just means you might not solve the clues in numerical order. Lastly, when it comes to extremely tricky books, a lot of the time, it is worth coming back to them again and again if you want to get the most out of them. I basically just accept that if I'm reading something by Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Aristotle or Wittgenstein, I will not understand it all the first time round. Again, we can think of it like solving a crossword. At a first pass, I might understand a few key concepts, but it's only on the second or third try that the work as a whole starts to make sense. I'm not saying that everyone has to read hard books more than once, but rather to reassure anyone who gets to the end of a difficult book and thinks, I don't know how much of that I understood, that this is totally normal. And next, we come on to some of my more controversial advice for reading hard books. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, both to the channel and, if you're feeling very generous, the Patreon. The links are in the description. 3. The sins of note-taking. One of the most frustrating bits of advice that I see given again and again when it comes to difficult books is that you must take copious or comprehensive notes. This is a pretty natural response when you're struggling to understand something or feel like everything must be important. We treat it like it's our job to get as much of the book down in our notebooks as humanly possible, lest even one slip of information pass us by. Personally, I have some gentle issues with this approach. The first is that making too many notes often discourages us from actually wanting to read. It's a lot easier to pick up a difficult book if it doesn't come with all the additional duties of noting everything in that book down. Even if you only understand 10% of a book, that is still a lot more than if you never read it at all, which is one reason why I'm just always reluctant to give any advice that will probably make it less likely that we pick up the book in the first place. So, unless you're reading something to prepare for an exam or because you're researching a paper, I only really suggest 3 types of note-taking. The first is just annotating little questions or comments in the margins of the book. This ties into our last point about staying actively engaged while reading. I also tend to underline certain phrases in pencil if they stick out to me. I find that there's no need to be precious about this. We can always rub out the annotations later if we want the book back in its original pristine condition. But I personally do this with almost every book that I read, and it really helps me work through the more complex ideas. As a bonus, since the margins of the book just aren't that big, you can't copy out the whole book even if you wanted to. This also makes rereading a book much easier, since you can review your annotations from the last time you read it, and this will remind you both of what was in the book, but also what you thought was important and what piqued your curiosity the first time around. Secondly, I recommend making just 3 notes at the end of each chapter. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but oftentimes the main 3 points of any chapter will sort of contain the gist of all the other secondary points within them. There's no way that you'll absorb all the information in a book, but you're much more likely to remember just a few key points. I often do this at the end of a book as well, and just note down what I thought were the 3 best ideas that leapt out to me across the entire work. I can't remember exactly where I picked up this technique, but ironically, I think it may have been from the memory expert Anthony Metivier, and I'll link his channel in the description because I think he's really, really good. For example, here are my 3 main points from Machiavelli's The Discourses on Livy, which is notoriously his most difficult book to read. 1. Machiavelli operates at 2 distinct levels. He has an idea of what the ideal state looks like with virtuous citizens and a balanced government, but he also thinks that pretending we are already in that world is a total disaster, and that leaders must be pragmatic in their decision-making and not be tied down by ideals. 2. Machiavelli thinks that republics are, on average, better than monarchies or principalities because they're less prone to corruption and nepotism, balance the interests of the powerful and the ordinary people, and thus are more internally stable. 3. Machiavelli constantly wishes to balance the twin goals of making a republic as free as possible while not allowing it to devolve into chaos or disparate factions. Interestingly, although this is only a tiny part of what was actually in the book, just these points remind me of a lot of the more detailed content, and not just that there's a general major theme of balance. For example, the first point reminds me that Machiavelli thinks a large part of how ideal your state will be comes from the virtues of your citizens, and ensuring that these virtues develop is a matter of education. The second point immediately reminds me that Machiavelli thought that France was the best example of a monarchy, because despite the lack of republican rule, they were able to ensure a high level of security and stability in their state. The third point reminds me that Machiavelli prizes freedom because he ultimately thought that what most non-aristocratic people desired was self-determination, and that part of limiting freedom comes in limiting the freedom of the powerful to control and oppress those without power, since this will lead to strife within the republic that you're trying to create. Each of these is also connected to observations Machiavelli makes about the ancient Roman Republic, but I don't want to recap huge sections of the book here. My point is that you don't actually need that many notes in order to remind yourself of a large amount of the information in a book, because if you record a few of the most important points, these will then bring to mind a whole bunch of other points that you won't have written down. The other kind of note-taking that I recommend is writing little summaries of difficult ideas as if you were teaching them to somebody else. This is a variant on the Feynman technique, which was developed by the physicist Richard Feynman, and it's how he continued to learn such an extraordinary amount of information throughout his life, as well as teach it to others. In a lot of ways, this channel is a collection of Feynman-style summaries and essays about great ideas, and I actually started making videos on philosophy mostly to help me with my own learning. It's just a wonderful bonus that so many of you happen to want to watch them. But again, an example might be helpful. So here is my short Feynman-style summary of Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. For Nietzsche, the will to power denotes many variations on the same core concept, that to wish to exert your will, both on yourself and the world, is fundamental as a motivator for human behavior. Over the course of his work, it develops from merely an observation that feeling like you're overcoming resistance is central to existential fulfillment, to saying that it's the single motivator behind everything humans do, to positing it as a broad metaphysical principle, similar to how Schopenhauer conceived of the will. Importantly, the will to power is creative and can give birth to new values, as opposed to merely force, which is more akin to brute strength. The broad idea is that someone else could read that and get a rough concept of what Nietzsche meant by the will to power, and how it differs from some other related concepts. Again, we can think of this partly in terms of prioritization. Rewriting short summaries of complex key concepts forces us to recognize what is most important about a concept. They always leave a lot of detail out, but that's kind of the idea. We're making ourselves write something out in relatively simple language to prove that we actually understand it. Lastly, I try to memorize a few of my favorite points out of each book that I read. I don't always end up doing this just because I'm quite lazy, but I genuinely do think that it's a great exercise, and I never regret doing it when I actually manage it. Firstly, having a concept in your head means that you can play with it at any time, which is just fantastic for increasing your understanding of what it can do and where it might be relevant. Secondly, it means that you have the concept to hand the next time that you're reading something, so that you can make comparisons between different authors on the same topic when you next come across it in a book. And thirdly, just like my notes earlier, if you remember one or two key points from a book, these will often remind you of a lot more of the book than you initially anticipated. To do this, I tend to use the loci method, which is an old memory technique where you use multi-sensory images placed around a familiar location to make something stick in your mind. If people are interested, I'll do a full video on it at some point, because it really was a game changer for my own learning. But I'll just run through a quick example. Recently, I had a discussion with an Orthodox Christian thinker for another channel, and that will probably come out sometime next year, by which point I will almost certainly disagree with everything I said in it, but hey hum. One of the most influential saints in this particular person's theology is Saint Maximus the Confessor. So, to prepare for this, I read the Oxford Handbook of Saint Maximus the Confessor, fully knowing that I would not be able to remember all that much of it. So I was sitting in my hotel room the night before, and came up with an image for the 4 points that I thought would be most relevant for the discussion, and I placed them around the room. One of them was Maximus's idea that the divine logos, or order, was reflected in the person of Jesus Christ, the books of the Bible, and the world itself. And so they all are, in some sense, mirrors of one another. To compress this into a memorable image, I imagined a Lego figurine of Jesus of Nazareth eating copious amounts of Lego before smashing a mirror over the head of a cartoon Bible, which then in turn turned around and smashed a mirror over the head of a cartoon globe. That is, the divine Legos, or logos, creates a mirroring between Jesus, the Bible, and the world. Now, it's worth not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good here. If you can remember even just 1 to 3 points from a difficult book, you'll be getting a lot more out of it than most people. And it's also a direct, active way to remain engaged with the text. And so it ties into our last section quite nicely. So that's my broad process of reading a hard book from start to finish. But there are also just a bunch of miscellaneous tips that I found really helpful, but also don't necessarily comfortably fit into any of these sections. So I just want to clear those up now. 4. Trinkets, odds and ends, that sort of thing. This is a strange tip, but I found it really handy for studying technical subjects. If you're struggling with a particularly difficult idea or passage, then read it before bed and then just sleep on it. I have no idea why this is, but I almost always end up being able to make slightly more sense of it in the morning. even if I haven't put any conscious effort into trying to understand it better. I'm sure that some very clever neuroscientists could tell you how this works, but I only know that it works. I find this especially handy when reading anything mathematical. I don't do too much maths now, but my master's thesis involved learning an awful lot of quite technical information about both fuzzy logic and modal logic, and I would quite often read through a few pages of a textbook before bed that I'd struggled with during that day, and it nearly always helped an awful lot. Secondly, ask for help. The internet age has brought its ups and downs, but an absolute triumph is the existence of websites like Stack Exchange or forums dedicated to particular topics. You'll be surprised at how many questions you have about a book or a concept that have already been asked before and have already been answered to really quite a high standard. Additionally, this is where the slightly irritating human urge to correct people is absolutely fantastic, since if someone gives a very low quality or incorrect answer, there's normally someone just underneath them clearing things up, often in an unhelpfully snarky tone, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. Obviously, don't base your whole research around this because there's no formal quality control, but it can be really helpful in a pinch. Thirdly, when it comes to difficult books, try to detach yourself from any pride you might have about how fast you read or how you only have to read something once to understand it. If a book is very dense or dealing with very tricky concepts, then you'll just naturally read it much slower, and that is totally okay. It took me weeks to get through Machiavelli's Discourses, and it is my full-time job to read and write about this stuff. That's a lot slower than my normal reading pace, but it was absolutely essential if I was going to actually grasp what he was talking about, as well as stop to Google all of his references to events in Roman history or Renaissance Italy that I hadn't heard of before. A lot of the online reading sphere is absolutely obsessed with how many books you're reading. And to be honest, I just don't think that's the best metric. I did a challenge a while ago where I read 51 books in 50 days, and I think it was fun, but it was basically useless for the harder books on that list. It was great for some pop science books that are written to be readable, but when I sat down to read something like a volume of Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation in a day, I just felt like I'd skimmed most of it to keep up with the pace of this arbitrary target. While I am a big fan of reading widely, attempting to race through a really tricky book is just going to be a waste of time. Likewise, don't be afraid to go back over a paragraph that you didn't quite understand and read it multiple times until you have an idea of what it means. Outside of a very strange corner of the internet, no one really cares how many books you read. It's far more important that you get what you want out of whatever you are reading. Fourthly, if you do plan to use the loci memorization technique from earlier, then just know that it'll take a while to get the hang of and that you'll get quicker over time. At first, it might feel like it's taking a lot longer than just rote memorization would, because you're still getting used to the process of constructing images that will stick in your mind. But once you get the hang of it, I promise it will be really helpful. It's something that almost all memory competitors use in some way, shape, or form, and they've memorized up to 35 decks of cards with it, and probably much more than this, so I promise it does work. And lastly, this is just what I found helpful. Your mileage may vary, and you'll want to add or take away certain things from this general guide over time. While there are a few core ideas that reliably help almost anyone when they read, things like doing a bit of prior research and taking a few notes, the more specific points that I've made here are worth tweaking and experimenting with yourself to just see what works best for you. I know it sounds a little bit vague and kumbaya, but you'll want to test out a few different techniques or tips and see what most resonates with your reading and most helps you understand things and help them stick in your mind. For me, I find that the memorization stuff is pretty key to properly understanding a hard book, since I quite often need to play with an idea for quite a long time in my head before I feel confident enough to write about it for a video. But you may prefer going back over that specific passage of the book, or just reviewing your notes. It depends on what works best for you. Also, and this is a pretty trivial point, but I do think it is absolutely important, make sure that you're actually enjoying your reading. Both because if you don't enjoy it, then I'm not really sure what we're doing any of this for, and because it's just easier to sit down and read a cognitively challenging text if you feel confident that you'll actually like the process. If you're having a good time, you're also much more likely to stay engaged with the work rather than just wishing it would be over already. So that's almost everything that I do when I'm reading a difficult book. I hope it was helpful in some way, shape, or form, and do leave your own advice below because I'm always looking for ways that I can improve my own reading habits and reading style. But speaking of hard books, we've talked a lot in this video about Albert Camus' The Rebel, and you can watch my breakdown of that book, where I have used all of these techniques in preparing and writing it, right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.